Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Parks series of talks in association with the Winchester School of Art today. We are very pleased indeed to have Professor Aomar Boum with us today, beaming in from LA in the morning with what looks like sunshine in the background. This talk coincides with the month of, in Britain at least, of Black History. And so Aomar, in part of his talk, will speak to those histories. Aomar is a historical anthropologist. He's professor at UCLA and the Morris Amado Chair in Sephardic Studies in the Department of Anthropology, History, Near Eastern Languages. And he's co-founder and co-editor of Tamazgha Studies. And he's interested in particular in the place of religious and ethnic minorities, such as Jews, Baha'is, Shia, Amazigh, Christians in post-independence Middle East and North Africa. Aomar, we're really pleased to have you speak today. Take it away. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sami. Let me try to share my PowerPoint first.
Sure.
Can you see it?
We can see it. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, so thank you so much for inviting me to share with you some of the work that I've been doing in the field of history as comics or comics as history, as well as the anthropology of, or doing ethnographies and anthropologies of violence, anthropologies of wars through visual comics, graphic histories, and historical and writing histories through visuals, in a sense. So what I'm gonna present here is I'm gonna give you an idea, or try to give a general history of some of the comics that were written and were published in the period of World War II that connects both Southern Europe to the Mediterranean. And in that, I'm trying to argue for what I call Mediterranean comics of mobilities. And when I say Mediterranean comics of mobilities, I'm talking here about comics of circulation that talk about circulation, displacement, internment, as well as refugees during the war and during war times and non-war times. Of course, before I get to World War II, I begin here with one of the most important comics that was published recently, called Le Tirailleurs. This is not a Senegalese West African tirailleur or conscripts in World War II by that were part of the French army, French African army. But this is a Moroccan and Amazigh from the Rif. It talks about the story of an Amazigh in the Rif during World War II, who was basically kidnapped by the French and then conscripted. Then he became part of regiment, and he fought the war against the Nazis in Europe. And that's what's interesting about this, is that you have two components. You have the visual and representation of this story, and then you have another part, which is done recently a lot, where we have representation of the actual individual photographs from his stories and from histories. So that's one element that I draw on, and then it influences the work I've been doing, not only in the book that I did with Najib Berber, which I'll talk about, but also in a work that I've done with my daughter about the story of my father and his connection to the French colonial establishment. And then you have most of these other works, the Dans l'enfer de Hrig, or illegal migration, between quote unquote, La Traversée, and then you have which talks about this. It's a recent iteration or writings of all these experiences of West African, Sub-Saharan African, North Africans trying, and even Middle Eastern, including Syrians, Lebanese, trying to migrate from North Africa to Europe through the Mediterranean. So that's the La Traversée, and A Valley, which is the story of the population exchange, Greek and Turks in 1922, before the end of the Ottoman Empire. And then the Clandestin de la Mer, which is a story of an encounter between an African American and a West African going through this back in history, and also looking forward to talk about the challenges of living as refugees in Europe. So these are just 4 examples that I'm laying out how that talks about, that makes the case for what I call a Mediterranean bande dessinée of circulation and mobility. Now, going back to the work that where this work stands as far as my actual work, this is a project that I've done with, I would say probably one of the, and it follows the same tradition of the Les Tirailleurs and other books that were written during World War II, where what I'm trying to do, I'm trying as an anthropologist and as well as an ethnographer and a historian to go back to the World War II moment, to the Holocaust period moment, and then reproduce these texts as an ethnographer in that moment. And so you have here a combination of the ethnographic, using the archive in a sense as an ethnographic experience to look at these different stories and experiences, and then write them using panels, write them through in a linear story, as if we are following the stories of these refugees, mostly European refugees and Spanish Republicans, as well as what I call other undesirables, including my father, West Africans, and European Jews, Spanish Republicans, and also many Muslims from Algeria and Tunisia and Morocco. So this is really what I'm trying to argue here. I'm trying to argue for when we talk about the camps and the internment camps in the period of World War II, in this moment of the Holocaust moment, the internment moment, whether the final solution moment in Europe or just the labor camps moment in North Africa, we're talking here about different people's stories coming together in these camps, and I'm trying to tell these stories using an ethnographic approach here. So, as I said, this is something that when we think about it, there is always here what I'm trying to do, I'm giving how I've done this, an approach of how I've done this research, but also I'm also highlighting the previous work that were done about this project, how different refugees were able to produce text using the same format, the comic, whether as a documentary or as a graphic history, in order to tell the stories that French colonial establishment did not allow because of the restrictions that were taking place during the camps about writing, taking notes, and so on and so forth, but also how this history influenced later on the works that I've done and the works that I'm doing and other scholars are doing. So this is an example which I think is probably one of the most powerful comics that or visuals that were produced by by Hofmeister, who's a Czech, who was a cartoonist, lawyer, intellectual who fled Europe in 1939, right as the Hitler invaded Poland, and then he gets to France. Later on he will be imprisoned, and then from there, after the French German occupation of France, he will be released. Then he will take a boat through Marseille, through Casablanca, and then he will end up in northern Morocco, but he will be taken to a camp, a labor camp. These are labor camps that began to function as before even the Vichy government was established. And then you can see here, he's given all these visuals, given a representation of life in Tangier, life taking the Atlantic to the Americas, and then ending up in New York. So he was one of the few stories of a cartoonist, comic producer where we have a story of what happened during the war. And then you have another probably the only one of the few comic or graphic. I'll come back later on and discuss this, what we call comic, what we call graphic histories, and so on and so forth. This is a story of a very short book called Carton Jaune. It's literally, it tells the story of Victor Young Perez, the Tunisian Jew, the boxer who died or who was killed in Auschwitz. And but it was told through the lens of a soccer player here, just for I think for property rights reasons here. There is another one just recently published, Alfred Naqash, the Algerian French swimmer who Sarah Stein has written a beautiful piece about him. I think you should probably read it. And then Sarah also invokes this idea of the Mediterranean as a space of writing the history of mobility here. And then the last one here at La Grande Mosque, the Grand Mosque of Paris, which is also mostly meant for children's here, largely from, I think, well, you can probably, it's less for high school kids, probably for K through I would say grade 6 or 7 probably would be suitable for that. Now, let me get back to my story with Najib. So there are different reasons why I am lucky in a sense, and I'm very fortunate in a sense to be working or to have worked on this project of a German refugee, German political dissidents who left Germany in Munich and then Berlin in 1933. This is a true story of the person, and then he ended up in France, and from France he ended up in Algeria and camps in Algeria. And to be working with Najib, who is Najib Berber, who passed away after the book was done in 2023. Najib was one of the founder. I still use the present. I will continue to use the present because I think Najib for me is still with us here. And what Najib has done in his life as one of the most important Algerian artists of Bande Dessinée, going back to the 1980s, he launched the festival of Bande Dessinée in Algeria. He worked a lot with Tunisians in projects like postcolonial. And you can see here, this is just a simple one-page iteration of his connection to two major artists, Slim, that most of you probably know, one of the godfathers of Bande Dessinée in Algeria, and Dorban. And when I say the reason why, as I said, I'm lucky to be working with somebody like Najib because of the importance of the Algerian Bande Dessinée in North Africa. You have Algeria, then Tunisia, and Morocco comes later. But now, even though things are changing now, the Moroccan Bande Dessinée is getting more, I would say, important compared to Algerian, which is receding. But in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, all the way to 1990s, we're talking about Algerian Bande Dessinée is probably one of the top in the region. It really gets to the level of all the production of comics and graphics that you see in Lebanon, in Egypt, Iraq, and Sudan to some extent. So that's one thing. The other thing I'll talk about why this book was produced in the way it was produced, and I think it benefited from the expertise of Najib, is that Najib is also aware of, conscious of three schools of comics. So you have the comic, the French comic, the Algerian comic, and the American comic. And his understanding of all of these different schools allowed us to use the style that we thought highlights what we wanted to communicate to the audience as far as this period is comics as history, this connection between comics and history as comics. And then the third point is that Najib is very well learned when it comes to Holocaust period, World War II, given the fact that he is married to the daughter and the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. So all of these different points in some way allowed me, and that's why I'm talking about being fortunate, to not to spend too much time explaining to the artist what I would be doing, because he's already knows. We just talked about the idea, we had the story lined up, and then we were able to produce it in the way it is. And then finally, as far as I'm concerned, I in addition to my training in history and North African studies and anthropology, I was also, for my BA, I did direction and script writing, and had an experience in drama and art. So that also allowed me to use that to write the script in the way that would fit what Najib wanted to communicate visually. So I'll just give you, here's one example, for instance, of Maqlid Dish. This is one of the most important bande dessinée in Algeria. It started in late 1960s. There's a huge, it talks about different social and political, economic issues. Here's one example that we tried to use we debated what style we should be using, and we went to the style that we end up using is somehow more a realist style. Yeah. And then the last point I would say about Najib is also his connection to probably one of the most important Bond comics and that was produced in Morocco by Abdelaziz Mourid, On a femme bien les rats. And actually, it's Najib who, when he was in Morocco in the late 1990s, early 2000, he was able actually to prepare not only the whole, because this is a story of a Moroccan dissident who spent a lot of time in prison. Many of you probably are aware of his work. And he did a lot of drawings when he was in jail during Hassan II period. And Najib took the document, actually, he helped Abdelaziz Mourid put them as in the narrative style he wanted him to produce, and then he prepared the cover of the book. This is the cover of the book, actually, is Najib's work. So this Moroccan connection between a lot of Algerian artists and the Moroccan tradition of bande dessinée goes back to 1990s. Even Slim's book were also published in Morocco too. So that's the last thing I want to say about this. So now, in addition, apart from my interest in the war period and in this notion of circulation, I'm also the story of writing about the camps is also personal to me. So this is a story. This is a photo of my father, who passed away last year at the age of 110. And my father was not only a regular person who lived in the desert of Morocco from the late 1920s until he passed away last year, but also he was connected he worked in one of these camps when Vichy opened one of the camps called Camp Bouazer in late 1940, early 1941. So he worked in that camp even before, I would say, the Vichy government was established. And in addition to that, he was also a mailman, or basically he delivered letters to the tribal lords of the Atlas, especially Al-Glawi, and later on the French government, when they conquered southern Morocco from 1930 until the late 1940s. So the part of the reason why I'm also interested in this is also there is a personal story that connects to the work that I try to do in southern Morocco. And in this project, where we talk about this, I just recently published this book with my daughter this year, and the visuals that you see here are visuals that were produced by my daughter Majduline Boum Mendoza, and she happens to learn a lot of these things from Najib himself. So she's a student of Najib. She's 14 years old. And she was able to, so this is another project that connects the camp in what we did in the camp throughout North Africa to the story of the South, but it's through the experience of the camp as well. So this is just like what I did with the first book, The Undesirables, with this book that I did about my father and his connection to World War II, to connection to the 1930s and 40s. It's also published in 3 languages, Arabic, French, and English. So there you can see here, this is the raqqas or the courrier. This is a profession that began in the late 1890s in Morocco through Moulay Hassan first, and then to connect Morocco to different cities, and also to compete with the European post. But you can see here, it ends in Marrakesh. It doesn't cover this place that I talk about here. And this is where this is where the camp of Bouezer was. This is most of the area that my father covered in this area. And then you see here, one of the few images they have about him here, going through, this is about 1942. This is actually an image where you can see, you see my father right here. This is one of the few images we have about him here. In the High Atlas Mountains. This is an image of some of the raqqas, also with a caravan route. Another thing you have, which connects to what I will be talking about of the project of the camps, is the idea that when the French arrived, there were no streets, no roads. So a lot of indigenous population was involved in the construction of roads, and then also the mines. This is the mine of Bouezer, late 1940s, Société de Transport Marocain, where my father in a way worked as well as did the courrier thing. Yeah, this is just a few more images. You can see here a presentation of course, Lyoté and Glawi, the two central figures as far as this story, which also connected to the camps, especially Glawi in the south. And then the Senegalese tirailleurs, who served mostly in the south to maintain, for political reasons, and also later on they will be used in the war in World War II. But many of them were stationed in the region where my father grew up. And okay, so that's the personal and the context of where this project's gone. In some way, it's built on the work I've been doing from an academic perspective, but there is a personal connection just to highlight these two elements that are central to what the project I'm doing. Now, I'm going to focus now on the camps, the Vichy camps, and how we can write stories of Vichy camps through comics and graphic novels. Before we talk about the camps, what I will say is that a lot of the work has been done by, first of all, doing extreme research, a lot of research about places that we don't have a lot of information about. And it started with the encyclopedias of camps and ghettos that I wrote a lot of entries for the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum about different camps that Vichy established, and we don't have any stories. So it took which is a project that took at least 5 or 6 years. And then from there, Sarah Stein and I, we did 2 projects, one on the Holocaust in North Africa. This is more of a theoretical book that argues whether we can talk about the Holocaust and North Africa, the Holocaust in North Africa, as some people would argue. And then from there, we moved from this meta story, theoretical story about how we discuss the World War II in the relationship to Southern Mediterranean, and to basically produce in a document or different documents, translating them from Arabic, Darija, Hakatiya, Moroccan Arabic, and so on and so forth, to English as part of a documentary history. So this is the first layout. And why is this? Because we're talking about, this is part of a colonial project. Why are we talking about the camps in general? The camps are part of a French colonial project that started in the 19th century or even earlier than that. And the French establishment, mostly in the 19th century, I would say, the French military establishment wanted to connect the Mediterranean to Niger, or the whole sub-Saharan Africa. And then at some point, they even wanted to connect the Mediterranean to the southern part of Africa. So this is part of what we call Mer Niger, okay, Mediterranean Niger railway system. And also we have another project which called Mer, and the African, a line that crosses the whole African continent. There was this is part of a competition, as many of you historians know, that involves between Italy, Germany at the time, even before World War II, and Belgium, over who control over transportation, because the French were interested in coming up with a railway system, that the easiest line that would connect sub-Saharan Africa to transport all the resources from different parts of Africa through the Mediterranean, through Oran, and then from Oran through Marseille. The quickest line. That's why you have this project was studied, and a lot of documents were written about it until the late 1930s, when it was approved by the Vichy government to Iran. And then you have another line that would connect Morocco and Oran to Senegal, to Dakar on the western part. So I can talk about that. So this is then you get here to, this is part of the argument we'll be making here, is that the Mediterranean and the Sahara become two sites of not extermination as far as the refugees, but also mostly labor. So labor becomes you're moving people from as early as the end of the Spanish Civil War, mostly Spanish Republicans, moving them as late as 1938, 39, to become part of the forced labor, to work in these different projects, transportation project, mining project, in order to facilitate the transport of resources and extraction of resources to Europe. This is why this camp, the encampment and the camp dynamics here are different from what we know about in the rest of Europe. And then this is why you look at this map, you have basically every dot you see here, there was a camp at some moment here. It's either for a project that connects to transportation, or a project that connects to build, and so on and so on. And this is in some way a part of also Vichy's model of what they call, what Pétain calls the revival of the colonial honor. Here you have two elements here again that go side by side. You have the use of indigenous work before the war, and then later on you have the use of European Jewish and Spanish Republicans labor, as well as Senegalese tirailleurs labor that you would say that you see here in this image. So this is an example, a very detailed example. You can see this is a cobalt mine, the Bouazer mine that I talked about earlier, that my father took part in it as early as 1930. It was the implementation of this mine was used by Al-Gilawi, which is a tribal lord of the High Atlas Mountain, in connection to the French establishment. Then Germans had their eye on this mine as early before even World War I. There's a huge competition. There's a huge study actually that was produced about it because of the cobalt. And then once Germany occupied France, one of the first projects that were actually launched by the German consulate in Casablanca is actually to go and look at the state of this mine. And it's in the southern part of Morocco on the Anti-Atlas. There's a book written about it called Le Démon de Bouazer, which talk about the founder of transportation companies called Lasatas. I don't go into detail about this, but it's really an interesting. This project is an interesting one. I have at least 9 hours of interviews with my dad just about how this mine was set up and the labor that involved, and then the German, especially Polish Jews, a few Polish Jews working here. You can see here that as 1930s, they start expanding it to include the military base, but also include housing for workers. And then also even women were used to work in this. Local indigenous women were used. But that's in general. But then all of these were connected to a very, very intricate system of railway system that I talked about, Mer Niger. This is on the other side of what we call the Bouarfa region, not far from Oujda, northeastern Morocco. And these are images that I took 2021, I guess, 2022, right during the COVID period. So I went to this area just to check what's left in these. This line goes all the way to Oran. Yeah. So it goes starting Oran, comes to Oujda, goes down to Bouarfa, and then comes back again to Tindrara and the other places. And then it goes back to Algeria again. And from there, it goes to Le Boucle de Niger. It's supposed to go all the way to the Boucle de Niger. This is some of the names, if you do an archaeologies of camps, you have see most of the products and that material is coming from Marseille or companies that are in Marseille. You can see. So this is something that I would really want to do more work about, the sites that still exist, potentially do something more archaeological work with archaeologists at some point. But this is a future project. It's also an idea for people who want to expand work on this. And this is one of the few buildings that are still standing in the area called the Tendrara railway station. This is a main site that connects mostly the areas in the southern part of Oujda or south of Oujda to Oran in Algeria. And I'm influenced here. What I'm trying to do in all of these, when I talk about these camps, I'm really trying to situate them in relation to what Agamben talks about in the question of the camps, and how different how different are these camps in the context of North Africa to the camps that we're talking about in the rest of Europe. Yeah. Of course, they are part of the idea of the undesirables, and it comes from this French discourse that talks about who can be classified as a French, as a real French, a pure French, and part of that has also to do with labor. So instead of while a lot of North African Jews and some North African Muslims, including North African Muslims, ended up in some of the camps in Europe. Some of them actually many of them died in these camps in Europe. You have many of these European Jews and Spanish Republicans will be used as undesirables used for forced labor in projects throughout North Africa. And that's part of a discourse, a colonial Vichy discourse that try to basically, it's a kind of rehabilitation of this and desire. They cannot be rehabilitated by working the land, by being part of this model of French citizenship, Republicans, but they can be part of they can be of a different use. And that's why you see the movement of a lot of early on, before the Nazis opted or called on the Vichy government to stop the movement of population from mainland Europe to North Africa, you have early on a lot of movement of Spanish Republicans and European Jews to North Africa to work in these camps. And they were moved on. This is one of the few images we have from one of the refugees in some of the camps, is this idea of the deportation of political Jewish and non-Jewish prisoners in cargo holds. This is a cargo hold called Jebel Amour, from moving people from Marseille to the camp of Jelfa here. And this is in this report, you can see some of the names that were moved through this example here. You have names from Armenia, Iran, Poland, Turkey, Romania, Russia, Hungary, Poland, Germany, and so on and so forth. And you have the actual names of the people who moved and why, the reason for the moving them from Europe for political reasons or being and for their anti-French activities and so on and so forth. I've been talking a lot about the line of how these railway system goes. So it starts here, the Mer Niger start from Oran, goes the way to Morocco, Bergen, and then Tendrara, Tedla. And this is what was finished by 1942. After that, the line was never finished. And it was supposed to go all the way to the Boucle de Niger. Where are we getting so that's the idea of what will we talk about. Now, what's the sources? One of the challenges that I have is, and then a lot of people actually in anthropology and history have been talking to me about, is the idea of the difference between fact and aesthetic. How do you, what you represent, is it factual or we're doing aesthetically? And how do you align these two things? Being telling history as history and telling history in an aesthetic way. And I believe you can do both. But before you do that, you have the information that you have to rely on has to be based on oral history, visual history, and the archives. That's how I believe this project, as far as I'm concerned, could be done. That's the way I did the project with my daughter about my father, and that's the way I'm doing also. I've done this project. So it includes, first of all, looking at what the archives holds about Jewish-Muslim relations, what the archives holds about Jewish experience in North Africa, what the archives holds about the Jewish migration or Jewish enforcement on Spanish Republicans from Europe to North Africa, and so on and so forth. So these are all documents that I looked at, and then most of them I was able to get them through the LICA archives in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, which is an archives that was taken by the Russians, the Soviet Union during the war, and then it was taken to Moscow. Later on, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum will scan a lot of these documents, bring them to DC, and most of the Arabic documents that I use in all of these work come from this archive, including books like the only document we have about memoir we have about an experience of a Muslim in some of these camps is this one written by Arizqi Berkani called, it's on the camp of Jenin Burizg. But then you have also a few novels that were left by survivors of these camps, especially Max Ob, who talks about his experience in Jelfa. You have also documents that talks about how Muslims also perceived Nazism and Nazi discourse and fascism and anti-fascism, books that are coming from Iraq and Egypt mostly, and then later on they were read by Muslim scholars and in these different areas. So for instance, this is probably one of the most important books that I use in the work, called كشف الستار عن نظرية امتياز بعض الأجناس نصيب الشرقيين في هذه النظرية, which is basically how Hamid al-Maliji, the author of this book, reads German anthropology about race and racial ideology and translated into Arabic, and also including making the argument where North Africans are placed as far as this theory. And then we have also few images of these camps. This is the camp of Jelfa. You see the main guard of then dog. So we have this idea, the landscape here. You can see there is there are no walls and nothing, because just a simple line of barbed lines around the camp. And the idea here, because it's in the desert. So the landscape, I talk a lot about this in some other work, where I talk about how environment becomes a space of erasure and of memory of these camps. So if you look at most of the camps that were established by Vichy, were largely in desert areas that easy to erase, but also in forest. If you look at the camps, also even in southern France, mostly in forest. So how nature can take over the memory of the place is also something that's central here. And then some of the labor, most of this, as I said, is This is mostly of the camps. And then life within these camps, mostly tents, what we call the Arab tents. Some of these are another image of what these camps were. And then the most, I would say, some of the most important names that went through this route, they didn't end up in camp, but they were able to leave after 6 months, like St. and Sophie Freud, who spent about 6 months in Casablanca, for instance. They were never able, they spent a few days in one of the, what we call the reception camps in Azmour, and then later on they were sent back to Casablanca. And actually, Sophie Freud ended up actually establishing the first school of the deaf in Casablanca. This is actually a project. I was able to locate the place. I'm still trying to figure out documentation about this. We don't have a lot, but she was able to establish, Sophie Freud was able to establish a space or a school of the deaf during her 6 months before she went back to the US. She went to the US through Tangier, and from Tangier to Lisbon to New Jersey. Now I'm gonna try to make the case for 2 more examples before I jump to the project that I've done myself, and I'll be quick because I know I have to finish, so to leave time for Q&A. So another thing that I want to say is that one of the project that I'm doing is also inspired by a project like this. This is from the archive. This was a document that we don't have a lot of these. We have probably 2 or 3 copies, but when this book was produced, kind of booklet was produced, it was produced in 75 copies. 75 copies. They were produced by an Egyptian Muslim who actually graduated from a school in Al-Azhar, from Al-Azhar, and his name is Abdurrahman Fitrao. We don't have a lot of data about Abdurrahman Fitrao, but he produced this called Al-Jinsiyya wal-Islam. But he basically meant racism and race and Islam. And from basically, it's an intellectual critique of Mein Kampf. And what he did, he took looked at different excerpts of Mein Kampf, and then produced visual or drawings that highlight the meanings of what the text says. Why? Because he was making the argument that we need to use visual to, and he uses the word natawasal, to engage. It's a question of engagement. Then you get here into the question of comics. To what extent comics help us engage with different audiences, and why? So he produced this with Lika people and with Ibn Badis and other Muslim association in Algeria, and this was circulated to some mosques. And through that, they were explaining to people the importance of being aware of the danger of fascism and Nazism at the time in around 1937, 38. And you can see here, this is one example. So you have an excerpt to Mein Kampf in French, then you have a transliteration of it in Egyptian dialect, and then you have a visual that accompany it. It's a very short book that you can see the same thing here. So that's the idea. But what I'm trying to argue here is the idea of engagement. And then you have few images that were done about the camp of Jelfa that were left. As I said before, the French military guards and the French administration did not allow any note-taking, any access to writing of refugees or internees during this camp. But some people were able to do that. So the Voyage de Gulliver, so Gulliver is one of the refugees and internees in the camp of Jelfa. He was able to leave some of these documents that were basically taken by the French military, the American army after the American landing. You can see here the example here, the Jebel Aomar, the same boat I showed before, Marseille towards Jelf. And then give an example of what kind of work it's done. And then the last one is Kimon Ivan, which is probably one of my, I think it's a fascinating project here. This was done by Marengo, who is basically a Greek cartoonist, born in Egypt and ended up in the UK. He did a lot of work for people in the UK, for different newspapers in the UK. And he has a whole series called Adolf Hitler, Adolf Himaruhu Pinto, basically. So basically talking about this connection between Mussolini and Hitler, but in a sense, basically talking about this fascism and the dangers of fascism in many ways. Now, I'm gonna spend just to give you, to end, I will talk a little bit about the project that I've done with Najib. So this is a project that tells the story of one man that we have an archive. We're able to get the archive, his story, through the archive at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum. But it's also but because his story follows a particular line of thought, and I wanted the story to take it to the different directions. This is where you get into ethics and facts. I used other stories similar from the archives, and I created a composite. So the composite becomes a way for me as a historian, ethnographer, to tell these different aspects and connections and nuances of what went through the head of different refugees / internees. And then through that, I had him engage with different players that are also separate in themselves, their separate life. So you have Yusuf Hans, who is the father of Hans, who fought during World War I. So you talk about the German experience during World War I. You have Johannes, the communist. You have Makhlouf ben Nissim, the Algerian North African Jew. You have Yousso, the Senegalese tirailleurs. And the Senegalese tirailleurs, just like African Americans in many ways, get erased from the story of what happened in the World War II. So even though there is now more and more push to tell these stories of these West African, Sub-Saharan Africans in Germany, and what kind of experience they went through during the German occupation of France, and the killing in Nantes, and so on and so forth. But that's also, I'm trying to push for telling similar stories of what happened in West Africa, especially using these West African labor during the empire's history, French empire's history, and what kind of challenges they went through also during World War II, and whether their stories were told, and whether they have a space in the French historiography or history. So, and then Julio, the Spanish Republicans, Mohand represent the North African Amazigh Muslim, and then you have the French captain, doesn't have a name because he represents a system. So, and you can see here that one of the things that Najib and I talked a lot about before we did. We want to have an immediacy. When you look at the panels, you can actually, every panel is so packed with different elements and stories and visuals, material, culture, and so on, that tells us something about the space and the place we are. So instead of writing it in ethnographic style, in the descriptive style, the image itself does that. And that's why we followed some form of a realism, quote unquote, style. Even when you talk about, for instance, the music and So that's one part. And then you get into conversation. So the ethnographic conversation is also central here. That comes from the document, comes from the historical archive. And then in another layer, which brings me to this idea that I talked about, we've thought about a lot, the idea of the historical dimension, is we filled different pages with actual historical documents, like this Le Statut des Juifs est promulgué, taken from newspapers, or sometimes taken the documents themselves. So that's another part. So we have on one level, you have a descript, you have the document, you have the conversation that takes place between the individuals, which is basically, it gives us this ethnographic immediacy, or the present moment, like living in the ethnographic present moment. And then you have also the historical contextualization. So I would say, unlike a lot of styles, like for instance, mouse style, where you don't see a lot of text, we have text here because I want this to be also, this is where the historical dimension and the ethnographic part also play a key role in forcing me, or at least forcing us, the two of us, to think about this. Even though Najib was more, have pushed more for less text, but we figure out, we got to a compromise where we limited a lot of text, especially at the end of the book, and then we had more introduction, as more text at the beginning of the book, to give this context and background. And you can see here, for instance, this is a text for the these are all actual documents from the archive. You have Uqbi, you have figures in National Algerian Muslim Association, Ibn Badis, you have the Lika connection to, and then you have the story of the mosque, and so on and so on. And then we get to the camps, and in the camps you have elements where we talk about the geographic context. We have the camps and their relationship to close villages, camps in their relationship to the larger networks of camps, and how people were moved from one place to another. That's also another part that we use in the. And then in that sense, we talk about the experience of other Jewish communities in the Sahara itself. This is where we get into the Jews of the Sahara, that Sarah Stein has written about it in her book manuscript. And then, as I said before, really one of the contributions that I think were central to this project is really the connection between the West African, the Spanish, the European Jewish, and the Muslim story. And as all of these undesirables, to some extent, are part of this narrative of extraction and forced labor during the Vichy period. So to conclude what I'm now and here. So what I'm the project in general for me is really a way to engage different audiences far outside the walls of the universities. It's really and get back to this question of engagement. When we look at thinking about all the books and then articles and academic articles that I wrote about these different types of experiences and histories, at some moment you get to ask, what is the role of the scholarship we produce when it comes to engaging with K through 12? And that's really one of the things I'm really concerned about, and one of the issues I'm concerned about is that how can we work with high school kids? How can we work with institutions like the schools of education and so on and so forth, to produce a style of comics and a style of work that engages with the general audience? And UNESCO, for instance, has done that. Even the United Nations High Commission of Refugees has done that with the one of the books that I mentioned at the beginning. Even Congolese government, for instance, with a very famous comic that they produced called Laba Napoto, which sold. They didn't sell it, but actually they donated over 125,000 books all across Congo to basically use the research we do as scholars by looking at the archives, by writing histories, to find a way to translate it to other audiences, and in this way engage or expand the sphere of engagement with larger audiences. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Omar. It's really, really rich, and yeah, it was really wonderful to hear you talk about the personal and take us through your becoming part of this artistic project, and re-engaging with your script writing past as an undergrad.